Hello, my name is Scott Nimerfro. I have angiosarcoma and I live in Woodbury, Minnesota. Thank you for letting me tell my story. On April 13th, 2015, I was going to take a flight from Minneapolis to Los Angeles when that morning I had a sort of a weird cramp in my shoulder. Now, I had had a blood clot in my leg like 10 years before that after a long flight from Taiwan to Minneapolis. And so I went into the local ER and the doctor there at first thought it was my appendix, but I found out later that made absolutely no sense as my appendix was on the other side. Not that it mattered much though, because soon after that my blood pressure dropped to 70/40 and they rushed me into a CT scan where they discovered that my spleen had ruptured. The hospital's pathology report stated that the cause of my spleen rupture was a benign tumor, but they then sent that spleen tissue off to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester for a second opinion and sent me on my way. 2 weeks later, I was in Los Angeles. I had just come home from work and I received an email from my primary doctor in Minneapolis that said essentially, "I hear you'd like to have some physical therapy on your shoulder. Sorry to hear about the malignancy." I, of course, was floored. I was like, what malignancy? This was the first I was hearing about it, and in an email. I then tried to get him on the phone. Of course, he was not in his office. They couldn't find him. I then tried to call my surgeon's office, and while they looked for him, they put me on the phone with the surgeon on call. Now, this guy wasn't much help to me because really the only thing he could get out of his mouth was, "Angiosarcoma, you don't want that. If that's it, it's really bad. You don't want that." Clearly that wasn't helping. Finally, they found my surgeon and he called me back and said to me that he had been trying to find an oncologist he could talk to about angiosarcoma before he let me know of the malignancy, and he was sorry that this had played out this way. He then gave me the name of an oncologist that he thought might be helpful to me. The next day, I called that oncologist's office and explained my situation and told them I had had this aggressive form of cancer and I needed to see somebody as soon as possible. And unfortunately, the nurse in his office then said to me, "Well, he'd be glad to see you, but he doesn't have an appointment available for 2 weeks." Now, I knew at that point, because I'd been on the internet, and which is probably the last thing you should do, but I had looked it up and I had seen that the median life expectancy of somebody with angiosarcoma was 5 months. And I knew that waiting 2 weeks wasn't going to be something that I could live with. At that point, I went on Facebook because one of my friends from high school was a prominent oncologist here in Minneapolis. And I reached out to him, Dr. Paul Zander, and he immediately got me into the hospital and was exactly what I needed at that time. He was kind, he was straightforward, and we went about doing all the tests that somebody else wanted to wait 2 weeks to give me. When the tests came back, the information was not good. The cancer had spread to my liver. It had also spread throughout my abdominal cavity. He suggested at that point that we try to make an appointment at Mayo Clinic in Rochester to get the opinion of an angiosarcoma specialist. I did that. It was not a good experience for me. I found them extremely arrogant and really had the feeling from the time I walked in that it was a dead man walking. They really did not give me much hope for future. But what they did do was they signed me up for a clinical trial that they were doing at that point, which was to do genetic testing on the tumors of cancer patients who were coming through the clinic. I agreed to do that and hoped for the best. In the meantime, both Rochester Mayo Clinic and my doctor in Minneapolis, Dr. Zander, got together and decided on a chemo regimen that I would start that next day. After 2 rounds of that chemo, which, as explained to me, was on a scale of 1 to 10, this chemo was an 8, but it really didn't do me any good because after 2 cycles, My cancer had continued to progress. It hadn't stopped it at all. I now had 2 tumors behind my eyes, as well as more tumors to my spine and bone. At that point, we were trying to decide what to do, but my options were very limited because due to DIC and other complications of the cancer, my platelets had dropped below 10. And at that point, I was told by an angiosarcoma specialist that if I didn't find something else to stop this cancer, I would be dead in 3 weeks. At that point, I asked Dr. Zander to reach out to the Mayo Clinic again to see if they had heard anything back on my genetic testing. Unfortunately, my own personal horror story with them only continues, as at first they couldn't find the data. They then didn't know if they'd even sent it at all. But while we continued to push, they eventually found my Foundation 1 report and discovered at that point that I had had something called an ROS1 mutation. Now, that is a mutation up to this point that they'd only really seen in lung cancer patients, and there was a drug that they were using called crizotinib that seemed to have some success with those patients. Nobody with angiosarcoma had ever tried this drug before. In fact, even to this day, I only know of one other person who has angiosarcoma and has an ROS1 mutation. But while the idea of using crizotinib seemed promising, the Mayo Clinic was against it. Their feeling was they had not seen enough research to back it up, and they suggested that I stay on my chemo regimen until it failed. Lucky for me, my doctor in Minneapolis had a different idea. He said to me that he didn't believe that another round of the chemo was going to make any difference, and if it was him, he would try the crizotinib. He would roll the dice. So that's what I did. I started the crizotinib the next day, and within 5 days, all of my labs returned to normal. My platelets went to normal, my red blood cells went to normal, everything was turning around. 30 days later, we rescanned and found that the tumors behind my eyes were now gone. The tumors in my abdomen were gone, and the lesions in my liver and bone had stabilized. I'm now coming up on 5 months of stability, thanks to the genetic testing that led to me finding crizotinib. Every day I talk to cancer patients and I tell them to demand from their doctors the same genetic testing that I received. It's your health, it's your life, it's your decision. Don't let someone else make that decision for you. Thank you for listening.